My Satan's meeting, you consent to being live streamed. Got it. Okay.
Okay, all right, so we have our mic over there. Just give me 1 second. I'm getting the stream set up here.
So we decided it's a problem. Yeah.
You decided it's a problem.
Yeah.
No. So yeah, okay. So I gave you this question, and I gotta be honest, like even, and what I'll present you with like an interpretive option when we look at this passage eventually, but it's a real conundrum. Like, how do you navigate conflicting loyalties? It's not always very straightforward kind of thing that you have to do. So yes, so it's the fact that it's a real problem, right? Does not surprise me now. So what were some of the things you talked about in your groups? Looks like Peggy over there, you guys have the mic in front of you. Did you have a comment? No? Frank, did you have a comment? What did Tom bring it over? Okay.
There's a conspiracy here.
Okay. All right. Well, what were some things that you talked about in your groups? Come on, you can.
I had a thing of in terms of Russia and all problems. Sometimes they just have a long simmering history.
Yeah.
And someone comes along and presses the button and tries it. And when we were in Chicago in the 70s, we were invited to our back neighbor's wedding of a child, and they were Latvian. And we were invited to the wedding, but we were documented to get into the wedding and to be a part of the festivities. And we asked, what on earth is this about? And they said, we are afraid of communist infiltration. This was in the 70s. And that simmered and simmered and simmered. And here we are now. You know, that whole Baltic area, it's vulnerable.
Yeah.
So it's kind of when you don't face something and let it simmer and pretend it's not there. It's tough.
Interestingly enough, like I remember, I think it was yesterday, I was scrolling through the New York Times, and there was an opinion piece that said, if you really want to know what's the problem here, why this is happening, you have to go back to 988.
Right.
The year 988. I didn't read the piece because I think I kind of know what it's about, sort of, but it's the depth of, animosity and the history. And I encountered that actually when I think I was in my last year of seminary, and we did a study class, like a study tour class. And it was each year this consortium, they would pass around this class. And that year it was hosted by the Orthodox Seminary. So we went and we studied and we read, and basically what we were reading about was the conflict in the Balkans. So it was basically the breakdown of Yugoslavia. What at the time had been Yugoslavia. It became Serbia, Croatia. And yeah, they were fighting basically over, there was an argument that was like 600 years old, was in part at play, alongside of like the power ambitions of current regimes, Milosevic and all these other things. So there's always this additional historical layer, especially over there.
On today's situation and in Luke, it's kind of hitting a crossroad between forgiveness and getting even. In today's newspaper, there's a lot of getting even.
Sure.
And we're trying in the West to be in a mode of forgiveness and let us reason. And it seems not to be working. Oh, it isn't working. I'll take it seems to be out of it.
Yeah.
Too bad that so many.
Make sure that we're passing it around.
The trouble is, there aren't that many people still alive that remember the horrors of World War II. I mean, in my family, there's nobody left from the greatest generation. If there were, they'd be 100 years old. And as people forget about how horrible things were, that's the problem. You repeat history, as they say. If you don't learn from history, you're bound to repeat it. And people would think that this is going to be like a world war again, and this Putin is going to be like a Hitler. And my grandmothers that go back to even World War II, World War I, back in the day, they used to say, "Oh, sure, we used to think, sure, that Hitler's kind of a nasty guy, but you know, we don't want to get involved over there. We've already done World War I. Let's stay out of this one." Well, that just didn't work. And people say now, people's memories are short because so many people are no longer with us that fought in World War II. So
Sure. Yeah.
that's part of the conundrum, I guess.
Did you have a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like in some of the meditations, we've had the thought about forgiveness and, kind of even within the church realm, and yet also within the church, we've had church abuse and covering up. So it's like, do you forgive or do you, covering sin
Yeah.
isn't the way to go, and just forgiveness has consequences too.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about, I would argue that forgiveness is not about forgetting, it's about remembering differently. And so covering up is a bad, it's not about forgetting, it's about remembering differently.
Well,
And where I'm coming from is basically Jesus's nail marks. Jesus comes back with these basically like signs of violence that were done to him. And but he stands in a different relationship to that history now. It no longer has the power over him that it clearly did when it put him to death. And so it's remembering differently, as opposed to just forgetting, I think is the way that I would talk about it. And that's what I shared in a sermon, I guess I did a few weeks ago in the alternative service.
well,
Hold on,
Christian, Sue,
online. Go ahead.
Sue and I took this differently. When you said convicting loyalties and we're talking about taxes, we talked more about the fact that in this day and age versus back then, they were under Roman rule. They had limited choices. We now we are supposed to pay our taxes. It's the law. And we can still have the freedom to be Christian. And as Christians, we go to the Old Testament. So we give 10%. That's what the Old Testament says. We can always give more. But we kind of took it. Of course, we mentioned Ukraine, but your question was conflict of loyalties. So do you pay taxes to the United States or do you give your money to God? And in this country, we have the ability to do both. We have the freedom to do both. Sue, what do you want to say?
You said it well, Diane. That's where we were.
All right. Well, that's fine. And in fact, that's probably a little closer, but I think a lot of folks wound up talking about what was happening over there, and that's okay in terms of just.
Well, I have nothing against it. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying Sue and I took a different tact.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm gonna shut this door, but then I'm gonna reopen it. Oh, that's thank you so much. It just gets really hot in here. So we're gonna shift now, and I'm gonna kind of move us towards starting. We won't get super started because I don't want Peggy to miss. Let's see here. Okay. We'll start from. Here we go. All right. I think Peggy discovered what we needed her to discover. Okay. So can I get a volunteer who is willing to read our opening
We'll go for it.
set of, okay, thank you.
We'll wait till Peggy gets closer. I was waiting for Peggy to come back here. Okay, anyway. So this is chapter 20, 9 through 19. He began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and leased it to a tenant and went to another country for a long time. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants in order that they might give him his share of the produce of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Next, he sent another slave. That one also they beat and insulted and sent away empty-handed. And still, he sent still a third. This one they also wounded and threw out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they discussed it among themselves and said, "This is the heir. Let us kill him also, so that the inheritance may be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Heaven forbid." But he looked at them and said, "What then does the text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. When the scribes and chief priests, interesting, realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to lay hands on him. At that very hour, they feared the people.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we are into Jerusalem. That's kind of the timing, or sort of the place that we are in the narrative that is. We've gone pretty much through what we would say is the triumphal entry proper, though this last parable scene here, I think still is a part of that. So if you remember the triumphal entry, we talked about the background of this, of a triumph, which was a common occurrence in the ancient world, certainly a common occurrence in Roman times, had to do with a procession of a general who came, would come particularly back to Rome in celebration of their triumph, usually a military victory. They would be dragging prisoners of war in tow. They would be riding in a chariot with laurels on their head. People would be shouting acclamations. All hail Caesar, who killed 10,000 people. Yeah, that kind of thing. They would enter into the city, and at some point, typically they would almost directly go to a temple. Usually, the Temple of Jupiter would have been the case in Rome, or maybe the Pantheon. Where they would then offer sacrifices to the gods. All right. So we saw there's a certain kind of similarity, right, in terms of Jesus's entry into Jerusalem, but there's some radical differences, clearly, right? He's not riding a steed, he's riding a lowly colt. People are not, cheering on for the thousands of people that he killed. Rather, they're exclaiming, right? And the text actually makes it pretty clear in Luke. They're proclaiming the great deeds of healing that Jesus has performed over the course of his ministry. Jesus then makes his way to the temple where we have a cleansing. And this also fits into certain expectations that we can also find regarding the Messiah. There's probably, and I didn't really get a lot of this in the research I was doing, but there are probably some connections to what was known as the Enthronement Festival as well, which would have been an ancient Israelite version of something kind of like a triumph, I suppose, though a little bit different. So there might be some connections there as well. But one of the expectations of the Messiah was that they were going to cleanse or refound the temple. And we talked about the different layers of meaning that's going on there, right? One, of course, is the pretty straightforward meaning that we get when we read the text, which is the critique, essentially, that Jesus has of the temple complex. And maybe we could just say the machinery, right? It's just become a kind of machine where they're just making money hand over fist, and as opposed to being what it's supposed to be. So there's a kind of cleansing in that regard. There's also, of course, this messianic expectation. And then there's clearly a third layer that we could say is simply the provocation, right? It's one thing that Jesus has been, doing all these crazy, amazing things out in the countryside, but now he's doing it in the seat of power, in the complex of power, right? Essentially, right? So the temple, so there's a kind of provocational element to that, right? Then we're not surprised, given that fact, that the very next scene is, so by what authority are you doing these things, right? That's the question. That's literally the section that just precedes this material, by whose authority. And Jesus gets into what I think it'd be fair to say is a very standard rabbinic interchange, where they ask him a question and he responds by asking them a question, right? I'll tell you what, I'll answer you by what authority if you tell me whose authority John preached, what was the basis of that. So, and what we got in the scene, as we kind of hear, particularly when the opponent's going to pull back, we hear the kind of their discussion, we get a sense and sort of inside look at folks who are operating really according to a very different logic than what Jesus is operating according to. And that's one of the things that seems to be at issue in the confrontations that are going to happen between Jesus and his opponents in Jerusalem. One is operating according to, I don't know, a logic of power, a logic of this world, etc., which eventually says this guy, that logic is the kind of logic that would say, we have a certain amount of power, we're trying to, keep our people somewhat safe, which means we have to appease the Romans. Here's a guy who clearly is a rabble rouser, whose people are calling him a king, who's threatening our power, but might even be threatening the stability of this arrangement. What do we need to do with this guy? We need to kill him, right? I mean, that's sort of the basic logic, I think, that leads them in the direction that they go. And that's not a very religious argument, right? I mean, that's just they can put some religious veneer on it, which they will do, but the argument is clearly something else, like in terms of the real engine that pushes that forward. So this scene then is a sort of conclusion, in a sense, before we shift a little bit into the scenes that follow, that flow out, but still, we're still operating here in a sense within the broader sort of triumphal entry kind of scene, I suppose we could say. And in this particular case, as I mentioned here, essentially Jesus takes the initiative, right? He goes on the offensive. He tells a parable, right? And we know, right, that Jesus is fond of doing this. We know that some of his parables are quite perplexing, but other parables are pretty easy to read. And this is a parable that's not that difficult to decode. And in fact, what we get in the scene is that the people who I think were the intended target completely understand, in fact, what Jesus is saying about them, and it enrages them, right? It adds to that provocation. So the parable, as I say here, it clearly flows out of what came before, of this scene. It kind of encapsulates, and we get, right, essentially in the way that he tells the parable, right? It sets up and reinforces, in a sense, what we've already experienced, and certainly what we are going to experience as we move through towards the cross, really. Now, there is a dynamic in here, and I do want to be careful as we kind of move through. And one thing I want to highlight is that there's some sections in this particular parable that have been appropriated and used in the history of the Christian church to either underwrite or reinforce anti-Semitism. And so I want to make sure that I'm going to kind of highlight those places, because we want to make sure that we're trying to be responsible, as we're engaging these texts. One of the really important ways that you can diffuse that is to simply recall the fact that, or to recall, essentially, are you having a hard time reading it? Okay, yeah, feel free to come on forward. Who is Jesus addressing? And I think it'd be fair to say, the way that I'm going to offer in terms of the reading is that Jesus is certainly addressing the leadership as opposed to the people. And I think the basis for this especially happens in verse 19, but it does make a difference, because if you read this, that Jesus is telling this parable to quote unquote the Jews, you could see how it could be used for anti-Semitic purposes and could have had the history that it actually ultimately does. But if this is a parable aimed at a very specific group, right, the leadership, which I think it is, then that kind of a reading is not as justified, at least in terms of the logic of the text, never mind the fact that it's not justified based on God's love. All right, so verse 9. So he began to tell the people this parable: a man planted a vineyard and leased it to tenants and went to another country for a long time. So the couple of things here, some of this is just would have really been, I think, pretty straightforward and easy for people then to pick up on. For us, we kind of want to be reminded. Number one is the image of a vineyard, right? This is a long-standing image for Israel, all right? So vineyard refers to the house of Israel. We see this in other places. I just give you one of the places that you could go to, Isaiah chapter 5. So this is a story then that's aimed in some sense at the house of Israel, but who within that, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. What does that mean? It means then that the one who plants the vineyard, the owner, is God, is Yahweh, right? And so Yahweh then is going to be sending people. And who's he sending? The assumption, of course, is the prophets, right? So this is really a story about the sending of the prophets, which is then, of course, reaches its climax with the sending of the heir, right? Who is that? Jesus. Okay, so you can kind of see how this is pretty straightforward in terms of the way that it unfolds. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants in order that they might give him his share of the produce of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Next, he sent another slave. That one also they beat and insulted and sent away empty-handed. And he sent still a third. This one also they wounded and threw out. So again, pretty straightforward. This is a reference to the history of the prophets, right? The prophets are sent as messengers. And if you think about the transactional nature of the vineyard, right? God, right? The owner plants the vineyard, and the tenants essentially work it, and they get to have their share, but they also have to share. So in other words, it's a question of justice, right? They're supposed to, in terms of righteousness and justice, give the share that they agreed to, but they're kind of refusing essentially to live into that situation. And of course, if we think about the history of the prophets, right? I mean, it's God's continually sending the prophets to remind the people to live lives of justice, right? They're not doing that. In their case, oftentimes what we have seen is they're sort of devouring one another. Then we get, of course, the climax of the parable, starting in verse 13. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they discussed it among themselves and said, this is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. So they don't just beat the son, they kill him, they execute him. What we're getting here, obviously, is sort of a foreshadowing in some sense of what's coming. So the owner of the vineyard, right, again, pretty easy to decode this parable, is sending his, right, I mean, his son would be the best representative in a sense if the owner himself is not going to appear. And of course, the beloved son language, we've already heard this applied to Jesus himself in the baptismal scene back all the way back in chapter 3, verse 22. So if there's any sort of doubts that we have that that's what's being talked about, we have a kind of clear link. All right, let me just stop for a second before I move into the second half of the parable and see if there are any questions. I know you had to move. Was there anything that you missed from before? Okay.
Christian, was this the law of the land that if the inheritor, like the son, was gone and dead, then the tenants who had been hired were the legal inheritors?
I didn't, I mean, in a sense, like there's a kind of absurdity to that, right? But I don't know. I would have to check really to see if there was any, in other words, if their decision to murder was based on sound logic. I would have to look at that or not. I can't imagine that it was, but I don't know like what would be the logic of, who would actually inherit the vineyard if the son had been executed or not. But I think that's a great question. And if in fact that wouldn't even stand, then it shows you how absurd the rejection is. Like on its face, it's a completely foolish decision. Aside from the fact that they're talking about murdering someone.
Well, it'd be kind of like mutiny on a ship, see, we got the ship now. Yeah.
Right.
And, but, there's a question I've got is, of course, you've got God going off to a country for a long time.
I think that's just the conceit of the parable, obviously.
Mhm.
Right. And it really, and actually I can make a comment about that in regards to the time period, which is a significant problem that people would have who were listening to this, like the average person, not just the leadership, but the average person would have been absentee landowners. I mean, and one of the things that you consistently see even in the prophets is they're complaining about people who add house to house, field to field. And once you do that, you can't tend to all those houses or all those fields. So you're clearly going to be gone. So in some ways, like it's an interesting wrinkle because God is put into the position of someone who is problematic to a certain extent, certainly for the poorer person. All right. Other comments in the room, questions, thoughts?
All quiet.
All right, all quiet on the Western Front here. All right, so let me move us forward then to the second half of the parable. And I'll start in 15b. Excuse me. Okay, so what then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? All right, in response to killing the son. And the answer is, it doesn't really surprise us, right? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. So I want to stop there for just 1 second. That should actually read 15b to 16a, I'm sorry. So this is the passage. When I referred earlier and I said there are some portions of this parable that have been lifted out and used to underwrite Christian anti-Semitism in particular, this is the place that I was referring to. So there's a very sordid history of interpretation, as I say here, because what it seems to imply, right, is the destruction of the tenants of the vineyard. Well, if you read this story and the tenants as the whole house of Israel, then you see how that could potentially underwrite sort of a kind of anti-Semitism, right? In a sense, like God has rejected Israel is sort of the way that it winds up getting read. This is where I think then that this question of being reminded, who is Jesus speaking to? Like, who is this parable really aimed at? Is it a criticism of the whole house of Israel, or is it a pointed criticism of a particular group of people within the house of Israel? And I think the latter, to me, is the better way of reading it. So if you went on the one direction, right, if the tenants then are the people, then it does seem to move in that more traditional and problematic direction. But if the tenants really refer to the leadership, which makes more sense, not only given the context, but given what happens next, what he says next, then you kind of, you're not kind of authorized, I suppose we could say, to read it in that direction. There is, however, there is a curious moment, which is in the second half of verse 16b. So the first half says, he will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, heaven forbid. So the question is, who is the they there? And what do we make of the response, right? So if this is pointedly aimed at the leadership, but Jesus, it says at the very beginning, all the way back up in verse 9, that he began to tell the people this parable, you could see then why the confusion might have been there and how this could have been misused. Whatever we say, obviously there's a kind of shock value, right? Because everyone understands that any kind of parable, vineyard parable, is a parable about Israel. And so this is a parable of judgment, clearly. And there's a kind of understandable shock. Now, again, I think that this is aimed especially at the leadership, but anyone who heard this potentially would be shocked by it. Then we get starting in verse 17 and 17 and 18. This is where really it turns and tells us that this is aimed at a specific group. But he looked at them and said, what then does the text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. Now, I don't have the actual, I did not, unfortunately, you probably can find this in your study Bibles. I don't have the text that he draws this from. Do you have it in front of you?
Psalm 118.
Psalm 118, verse
22.
Verse 22. So I don't have that up on the screen, but you might want to write it down.
Psalm 118, verse 22.
Okay. 118.
118.
But how it's the way that this colors, right? Because it's not aimed at the people who go into the building. It's aimed at the people who build the building. And who are that? That would typically be the leadership, right? So the leadership has rejected the cornerstone. And you need a keystone or a cornerstone to begin a process. And if you don't accept, if you don't have one, obviously you have a problem, you can't build it. But if you reject the wrong one, right, that could also be a problematic thing, and could lead to disaster in a sense, if you were going to get into sort of architectural, I suppose, kind of if we were going to run down that rabbit hole. The point, though, of all that, without getting kind of dragged totally into that, is that the act of rejection will have a catastrophic consequence, right? Because this one's right. It says, everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. So to reject, in other words, Jesus and his ministry is effectively to reject yourself, to be rejected. And so in a sense, like you make your own, you kind of make your bed and lie in it. It's kind of the way that he's aiming this. And he's aiming it, again, not at the people in general, not at Jews in general, not even at the house of Israel in general, but specifically at the leadership, right? The scribes and the like the temple guard, the as we heard earlier, the chief priests, etc. And that's what we'll actually hear right now in verse 19. When the scribes and chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to lay hands on them at that very hour, but they feared the people, right? So we kind of land the plane and in a way that I think is especially non-anti-Semitic, which is my goal. So leadership confirms, as I say, they in terms of their response even to Jesus, rather than hearing what he had said against them and being cut to the quick and saying, what must we do? Which we heard things like that all the way back in the gospel, with the ministry of John. They want to kill him. Like that's their response. And so in that wanting to kill him, they kind of confirm who they are, right, essentially. And you get a sort of a foreshadowing of what's coming next. For now, though, of course, they have to be careful, right? Because the people are we still have a divided city, essentially. Yeah. All right, let me stop for just a second and see what kind of comments we have in the room or online.
Just one other point with this is that I think this is read every Passover as well. And so, but also we've got two lines down from that. Adonai is God. He gives us light. Join in the pilgrim festival with branches all the way up to the horns of the altar. So
kind of like that, sort of that triumphal
entrance anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. All right. That's a nice allusion. Other comments, other questions, about folks online?
Christian, when Bonhoeffer was responding to Hitler and the whole anti-Semitism and the whole, pulling together the Jews, was this brought out at all that this was misused in the Bible?
Like this specific section, you're saying?
Well, yes. And the general comment that, Christ was referring to the leadership, not to the people. In terms of anti-Semitism, supporting that whole effort.
I think I'd have to go and look specifically to see if Bonhoeffer offers any kind of commentary.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that he got into the weeds.
Okay.
Of something and into sort of the kind of, hey, this particular passage has been misused.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that there has been up to Bonhoeffer a long history of reading a passage like this in that kind of a way. And I'm just trying to sort of dust off my memory of because I've taught classes and we've read some of the kind of Christian anti-Semitism materials. And it's quite possible that a passage like this would just be quoted as a justification for these kinds of attitudes, but there's no specific one comes to mind for me.
Yeah,
so.
I just find it tragic that we find kernels of that in anti-Semitism today, and you just think, absolutely. Oh my goodness, yeah.
I mean, and the Gospel of John is another text that is particularly used. Yeah, has a real bad history in that regard.
Just in that regard, you think of what's usually thrown out is the Jews as the Christ killer. And,
right.
And, right. The passage saying, let his blood be upon us,
right.
And so, and upon our children.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Misusing those passages.
Yeah. Right. And there are several. And in fact, at one point there was a very specific prayer in the Roman Catholic Mass that was said during Passion Week that reinforced some of that, and that was removed in post-Vatican, after the 1960s. But there's also certain Passion plays. So like the Oberammergau right? That one that sometimes happens, the really big passion play that happens in Germany. There have been some questions about that role, so there just are places where you can find this. And it's especially if we come upon something that has a history, I'm going to try my best to highlight so that we're thinking very carefully about that and not falling into
And
that.
also you wonder, if you got the Roman Catholic Church, you wonder if there's some wanting to kind of make the Romans more innocent in
Mm.
if it's not the Romans, then maybe we got to blame somebody,
Well, one of the theories about, there is a theory, I think it's connected actually to Luke, that in some ways, like, there are attempts to exonerate the Roman authorities, in part because, not because they like the Romans, but because they don't want to get killed by them. Right. And so, and I think it's especially stark in the book of Acts. Like here, I think we still get like the Gentiles, i.e. Pilate is going to execute this guy. And there's no, like, we've gotten several, we've already gotten at least one scene where we hear that he went in and slaughtered people when they were offering sacrifices. So we know that this guy is not a good actor. But that's definitely, our authors have those kinds of elements that are a part of the telling of the story. All right. These are great questions. So let me move us forward into our next passage. So can I get a volunteer who's willing to read this passage?
Thank you. So they watched him and sent spies who pretended to be honest in order to trap him by what he said, so as to hand him over to the jurisdiction and authority of the governor. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you are right in what you say and teach, and you show deference to no one, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, "Show me a denarius. Whose head and whose title does it bear?" They said, "The emperor's." He said to them, "Then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were not able, in the presence of the people, to trap him by what he said. And being amazed by his answer, they became silent.
Okay. So as I said before, this is one of these like very famous scenes. You've probably heard this before. And one of the interesting things when I was kind of, reading in the commentators and stuff is there is a lot of division and a lot of different ways of interpreting this scene. And so as I say here, it's a bit of a conundrum because it has produced such a significant division about what exactly does Jesus mean. And the imagery, it's not just what does Jesus mean, it's the fact that the imagery is so sort of crackling in a sense and like generative that it's been pulled out and applied to all kinds of questions in ways that like maybe it shouldn't have been. So one of the places where we see this is a question about church and state, right? What's the proper division? And in fact, this passage was actually used, I can say that quite clearly, with the rise of Hitler and the attempt to Nazify the church. This passage was oftentimes thrown at folks who were critiquing the government, and basically was an attempt to say you have no right to do that because you have to give to Caesar what's Caesar's and you have to give to God what's God's. So it was an attempt literally to kind of create this sanitary cordon, right? This kind of dividing line or whatever. So in that regard, in terms of your earlier question, Sue, this is an example of something that definitely was used in that context.
Mm.
All right, so let's start then in verse 20, because as this story goes on, in a sense, like Jesus's opponents become creepier and creepier, right? Basically, right? So they watched him, and they watched him, and they sent spies who pretended to be honest, right, in order to trap him by what he said, so as to hand him over to the jurisdiction and authority of the governor. So like I said, like we're getting more and more of their internal motives are kind of coming out, and more and more feels more and more sinister in terms of the folks who are after Jesus. And so you can feel the pressure building. And it's interesting because I think if you compare, and again, I'd have to go into Luke, and in this regard, I feel like we oftentimes will mash up all of the different passion narratives, and we won't really remember exactly what details go into which of the gospels. But I think the three common accusations thrown at Jesus, or as a basis for his execution, are, destroy the temple, claims to be Messiah, which also has a potential political angle because he could be an alternative king to Caesar. And then also the other one, we shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. That's another one that he gets accused of. So this is one of those that shows up here. So super creepy, right? And the deviousness, as I say, of these authorities is then brought into view as well. And as I mentioned before, it begins to echo then the last of Jesus's passion predictions, right? So there are three predictions that were offered, and each of them brings into view a slightly different element of what will ultimately happen in the final one. The concluding additional element is that the Messiah is going to be handed over to the Gentiles. And what do we hear? They want to hand him over, right, to the jurisdiction and authority of the governor. So then moving into verses 21 through 22. So they asked him, "Teacher, we know that you are right in what you say and teach, and you show deference to no one, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" And, again, the creepiness, right, of the opponents, because it's like, did you guys ever watch Aladdin, the cartoon? It just reminds me of the vizier, who like the diamond and and you could just sort of feel the irony dripping off the lips as they address Jesus, like, "We know that you are a great teacher," right? So they're clearly flattering Jesus, like trying to butter him up before they bring what basically would have been a significant question, right? So this question about paying taxes here, this is not a simple question. And of course, the answer that Jesus gives is not a simple answer, which of course, this is why I think we have such, vastly different kinds of ways of interpreting this. This would have been definitely a live question. I mean, of all the questions that we've seen in confrontations, some of them feel more obscure. I mean, even the next scene feels a little bit more obscure because it's this whole question about the resurrection. This question would not have been as an obscure sort of point of religious doctrine. This is about, what do we do with the people who are living in our backyard right now, right? So as you can see, it would have been a live question and would have been significantly contentious, right? There would have been groups who said, you have to pay, we have to collaborate. It would have actually, to echo you, Diane, it's the law. It would have been the law then too. So you have to do it. There would have been others to say, no, you can't do it. It's idolatry to even come into contact with this stuff because it has idolatrous things on the coinage, which is going to be one of the ironies in just a minute when he asks them if they have a coin, and the fact that they're carrying a coin around basically also shows, how they're already collaborators. And then there are others who would have said, no, we can't do it, like the zealots, because we need to overthrow these people, right? We need to basically violently rise up against them. So what could we say? Again, here I'm kind of offering one way of interpreting this, that this is not so much a question about church and state, which is often the way that it's been, state being giving to Caesar and church being giving to God. But I think really it's about loyalties, right? Where do our loyalties lie? And then there's a built-in contrast. And in particular, I think this kind of bears out in Jesus's answer, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Lastly, this is a really good question if you're trying to trap him. It's an almost impossible, because if what the trap is to not only get him to say something that would get him in trouble with the Romans, but to get him to say something that might also get him in trouble with the people. Right. And so if the people have a feeling, that no, we shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, that's one thing. If he says, yes, you should pay, well, that, you would get into trouble with the people. If you the opposite, you get in trouble with the Romans, at least that's sort of presumably. So it's a pretty crafty question put to him by his creepy opponents. All right. So what happens? Jesus, right? He perceived their craftiness, right? I just love that description there. But he perceived their craftiness and said to them, show me a denarius. Whose head and whose title does it bear? They said, the emperor's. He said to them, then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were not able, in the presence of the people, to trap him by what he said. And being amazed by his answer, they became silent. And this is going to be one of the things, like, in a sense, like we have verbal combat going on. And eventually they're not going to be able to match wits with Jesus. So they're going to shift to a different kind of combat. And that's when, eventually he's going to be arrested and executed. All right. So number one in this answer, the fact that they're actually able to produce a coin, in a sense, shows some of their duplicity, right? These coins, they not only have the inscription of the emperor on it, like in terms of like an image of the emperor, that oftentimes it also acclaimed the emperor divine, or it acclaimed Rome divine. And so that's the idolatrous part of this. And the fact that they're carrying these around, even people who said you should pay taxes would do their best not necessarily to have that in their pocket, etc. So what do we make here then of Jesus's answer? Because I think this is really where it all hinges. It's in the second clause, give to God what is God's. So number one, and this is where I think there's a contrast here, because it's a contrast between the image of the emperor and the image of God. And think about that contrast, right? The image of the emperor is something that's stamped on this little coin, but where's the image of God stamped? Everywhere. It's the whole of your life. You are created in the image of God. So the contrast, in a sense, is if you give to God what is God's, there's not going to be anything left, essentially, or whatever is left is going to be of very little value. But sure, give it, do whatever. So that's sort of that's what I mean when I said above. I think this is a question about loyalty and an unspoken contrast. If you render, right, to the one who has stamped you with that image, what else will there be? Not much, if anything. However, I do think, and this is where I sort of, step back and try not to live or die by the interpretation I'm offering in this particular difficult passage. I think it's fair to say that Jesus does and doesn't answer the question here. Rather, he poses a new kind of riddle, in a sense. It's not straightforward, but it still has the ability, this answer still has the ability to silence his opponents, precisely because they can't get around, they can't accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, which isn't necessarily an answer to the question so much as something that will incriminate him. All right, let me stop for a second and see what kind of comments or questions folks may have in the room or online.
See, a natural follow-up
Hold
question.
up to
The
Hold it.
follow-up question would be, what is God's?
Right. And everything.
I mean, these are all Gentiles and all kinds of people out there.
No, these would have all been Jews, more than likely.
Okay, in either case, the question is, what is God's? And how do you give it to him?
Everything is God's, and therefore you give back, right? You give your whole of your life. And so in a sense, like it completely lowers the claim that the emperor or Caesar could have as in comparison. I mean, that's the contrast, I think. Those other kind of questions, the ones that you're asking, sort of the more practical ones, yeah, I agree. You'd have to have kind of a longer conversation in a sense with Jesus about what is he saying precisely. And that's why this is both a really profound answer, right, that avoids the craftiness of their attempt to trap him, but at the same time, like exactly what Jesus meant is not entirely clear in the way that the parable just preceding was a lot
Right.
clearer. Yeah.
And exactly going back to the parable, the vineyard is God.
Yeah, the whole
So-
thing.
So, and not the Romans. So, but they're the ruling party at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Other comments? Thoughts in the room?
The argument, to follow up on what I said. He's saying that what is the Roman emperors give to the Roman emperors, which means it's not God's.
I mean, he's creating a contrast.
Yeah, he's creating a separation.
Yeah,
And we have that today. I mean, in our daily lives,
sure.
it's tax time. So we all pay taxes to the government.
Though I think this to me is where we fall into the trap of is this just a question about church and state? And I'm not sure that that's really the essence for Jesus. In fact, what I think he's trying to do is to diminish the claim that Caesar has in this regard. But yeah. Other comments from folks online?
Nope.
Nada? Diane?
Well, it's really, for me, I'm just thinking, the people that are trying to trap Jesus, the leadership of the Jewish church, if you will, are the ones that are supposed to be giving their lives and everything they have to God.
Indeed, that's right. That's exactly right. I mean, they would typically be at least the way it's described, they would be priests, right?
Right.
They would be from the tribe of Levi or some, connection thereby. So that's right. So the irony in a way is also built in that regard. So yeah, that's a good point. All right, well, let's do our last little bit here of text. If I can get a volunteer who's willing to read.
I'll read.
Okay, go ahead.
Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to him and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if as a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there are 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her, and so in the same way, all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God, not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him another question.
Okay. Yeah, so this is like mic drop time for Jesus. So let's kind of move through this material, and I think it'd be fair to say, right, in this confrontation, and really, like, I think if we were to look at the time that Jesus spends in Jerusalem before the passion starts. So the passion narrative, in a sense, starts in chapter 22. That's when we get the trial, and we get, the upper room. We get them, they're plotting to get him arrested, all that kind of stuff. That starts in chapter 22. We have the triumphal entry. We have also then this confrontation, basically, between Jesus and his opponents. And then we're going to have like an apocalyptic section in chapter 21, basically, where he's kind of warning people, essentially. So I think this is, I can't remember for sure, but I think this may be one of the last of the confrontation scenes that Jesus has with his opponents. And it's fitting that if it is, that it would end in verse 40, right? They no longer dared to ask him another question. So the confrontation then continues. And now, though, we have an additional group introduced to us, right? The Sadducees. And at least in terms of Luke's gospel, this is the only place where they are mentioned as a separate party, though they will reappear in the book of Acts, right, which is sort of the second volume. What can we say about the Sadducees? At least, in terms of the data that we have, as I mentioned here, it's sort of a philosophical school who was probably centered more in the city, right, in an urban area. Particularly a place like Jerusalem would have had a relatively strong grouping of that. They are usually thought of as people who would have been collaborating on one way or another with the Romans, because that would be the way that they would protect their power or their wealth. And they only followed the first 5 books of Moses. So they reject the oral Torah, and they probably would not have held to the authority of the prophets or something like that. But that's sort of, again, kind of a thumbnail sketch in terms of just what has been put forward traditionally. There are some folks who argue that we don't really know anything about any of these parties, and we should be careful what we say, because the evidence for it is so scant. So just keep that in mind as we think about who these folks are. The text, though, of course, tells us what's germane, and that is that this is a group that does not hold to a resurrection from the dead, right? Yeah.
You said they rejected, that says that they rejected the oral Torah. But
Yes.
You said that the Torah, those 5 books, were the only ones that they accepted. I don't know.
That's right. The written Torah.
Oh, they accepted written.
That's right. They accept the written Torah, like the first 5 books of Moses, but they reject the oral Torah, which is the additional teachings that would have also, to some extent, included other texts like the prophets, etc. And I think it's in the prophets where we get sort of the strongest direct messages about the possibility of resurrection from the dead, though there are clearly glimpses of it earlier on, but they don't read it that way. All right, so verses 28 through 33 set up there. And remember, they're not asking this because they really want an answer. They're asking this in part because they're trying to trap him, right? So this is another one of those kinds of questions. So, teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her And so in the same way, all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Now, there's a couple of things at play in this question. One is the reality of what's called levirate marriage, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And the other is the conditions that they're operating with. That is the condition that people die, right? And so, and if you bring these two together, then it creates this situation. So this is meant to, in a sense, the question is meant, like I said before, to kind of further divide the crowd. In this case, it would probably be a division between the Sadducees and anyone else who held the doctrine of the resurrection, which certainly we know the Pharisees did, but maybe large swaths of the people, we could also say, would have done that. So this is, and you could theoretically, and I don't have a thing up here, but like even as we were reading through and I was thinking about it, you could read this as an attempt to offer a justification for the Sadducees' collaboration with the Romans, right? That their reading of the Torah is proper, and that's the justification for what they're doing in a sense in collaborating. All right. So what's levirate marriage? Levirate marriage is basically something that's described in Deuteronomy 25, which is established, basically the idea here, right? That as it says, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, that man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother, right? So it's meant to extend the family line. That was the idea. And you had to do this service. And I don't know, there were significant, I think, reams and reams of teachings about this in terms of making sure that it was properly carried out, et cetera. And I don't know how common it would have been, though, obviously with people dying at much younger ages, maybe it was. It's an area then, as I say, that's widely attested. We have, discussions about this in the Talmud, which would be the oral Torah at that time, at least, et cetera. So another live question, right? That one that has kind of a historical, and I think the way that this functions is like a reductio ad absurdum, right? They apply this law in this way, in a sense, to create an absurd situation, right? Which is in the resurrection, to whom is this person connected? So if you apply the law to the conditions of the riddle, the conditions being that people are dying, and then you bring in a physical resurrection, it's going to produce a situation that's virtually impossible to deal with. Like it's just absurd. So what's the solution? The solution in some sense is to toss out the idea of a resurrection, because that's what creates this situation. At least that would be maybe from the Sadducees' point of view, how they might answer this. So Jesus answers their question, their query, and the way that he does so is precisely to undermine the conditions, not so much the law, and certainly not a doctrine of the resurrection, but rather the conditions that they are assuming in the asking of their question. So his answer, in a sense, unwinds the premise of the riddle. And he does so by emphasizing the radical difference of the kingdom versus the logic that they're operating with. They're operating with the logic of this life. He's operating, when he talks about the kingdom and the resurrection, he's arguing that the situation there is going to be radically different and other, right? Something like marriage or death or connection like that is not going to pertain necessarily in that situation. All right, so verses 34 through 36. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore, because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. So the conditions, in other words, that pertain in this life, right? That people marry and are given in marriage, and that they're subject to death, right? Those are the conditions. And that's the basis for the riddle. And that's what produces the absurd situation. If it carries over, his argument is that that doesn't carry over into the new age. It doesn't hold any longer in the new age. So the premise, in a sense, of Levirate marriage doesn't pertain in the age to come. And that's why this question is essentially illegitimate from Jesus's perspective. So that's what I mean when I say that he unwinds the premise of their riddle. He then addresses sort of a deeper issue, right? Which is not really what they asked about, but was clearly written into it, which is there really a resurrection, right? That's the second part of this verses 37 and 38. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed. And it's very important here that he appeals to Moses. He doesn't appeal to the prophets, right? So he appeals to the text that they themselves would say that they hold to, which is the first 5 books of the Torah. So, and the fact that the dead are raised, Moses showed himself in the story about the bush. So, and this is one of the most important stories. This is where God reveals God's name to Moses, right? So this is a high point moment in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God, not of the dead, and that's an assumption that everyone would function with, but rather of the living. For to him, all of them are alive. So the way that even, he utilizes basically the grammatics in the story, the grammatical construction, which makes it sound like they are present as opposed to past. So that's how his answer essentially functions. So he turns then to address their own skepticism. And he does so using, again, a basic rabbinic method. So he shows himself in these couple of different scenes with these folks to be as much a rabbi as anyone else in the crowd, but of course to be even more superior, right? So he points out the verb tenses in Exodus chapter 3. That would have been a common strategy employed in their answer in terms of this question. So God speaks of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the present tense. Therefore, they must be alive in some sense. That's what resurrection is about, right? From Jesus's. So it's like, first of all, he unravels their question because they don't understand the newness of the kingdom. And then secondly, in a sense, he unravels their reading of scripture. Like they haven't actually paid attention to the very text, which of course has been the case all throughout. So it doesn't entirely surprise us that this is the way that Jesus responds to them. Then verse 39 and 40. Then some of the scribes answered, and I wonder who these might have been people who were pro-resurrection, who knows. Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him another question, right? So the scene ends with, like I said, mic drop, basically. So as before, they're left speechless and they don't really know how to engage, certainly not if they're trying to trap him. And this I think then gives us more of a sense of why this is heading the direction it is, because they don't know how to solve the problem that Jesus seems to represent to them as a threat to their power or whatever the case may be. They can't find another way. So there's going to need to be a different option. Okay. Let me
Christian,
stop.
I just had three little thoughts. The first one being the woman who was married to 7 men, she outlived them all. We know who the strong one is. And then Jesus being the ultimate rabbi. Really, he's just the ultimate rabbi, Julie. And it's just remarkable that we are so blind sometimes to something that is so beautiful and so good.
Yeah, and I think to further deepen that, teacher literally means rabbi, or rabbi
Right,
means
right,
so that
right.
we would read that and we might not think that, but I think when we see all the methods that he utilizes and the way that he argues and the way that he asks questions, I mean, he's Jewish. He's a Jewish rabbi,
Yeah. Well, and the third one was in today's, we would say, Jesus, good job.
Yeah. Nice. Are there some comments in the room? We have the mic. Kirby's got the mic. Any comments, questions, thoughts here at the end? I'm sorry, we went over a couple of minutes.
Just that we have an example of this in Genesis with Judah before the Torah was given. His three sons, are kind of in this dilemma of marrying and dying before a child comes about. And in fact, Tamar takes the matter into her own hand and sets herself up as a prostitute and snares Judah into one-time affair, and then actually comes from the lineage of is Jesus is in that.
Yeah, I don't remember all the particulars and details of that story, but that's very, yeah.
But
very
also I
interesting.
love the line in Matthew where he says, in the same passage, he says, "You go astray because you're ignorant of both the scriptures and the power of God."
Which fits actually really
Yeah.
well, I think, in this regard. So, all right, let's. I know folks have to go, and so let me just say a quick prayer, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Lord, we thank you for this beautiful day. We thank you for the time that you give to us to fellowship and to wrestle through Scripture. Please be with us. Let the things that are of you and the things that are useful stick with us, and those things that are not, let us just lay them aside and move on with our day, attempting to follow after you. Thank you again. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.